When there is something dangerous, when we are scared or fearing for our life, we run away. We know what it is to get out of there as fast as we can. And if for those like me, you hear us say, I'm not a runner, so if you see me running, then you better start running, because that means I'm running from something big, bad, and ugly. But we know that's in our nature, that when we sense danger, when we're afraid that being in a certain place, or when we're afraid that something is going to happen, we run, we flee, we get away as fast as we can. And Paul, the apostle, uses that imagery, uses that idea of fleeing, of running away, of getting out of there as fast as you can when it comes to temptation and sin. There are actually several places specifically where Paul uses this wordage, this imagery of fleeing, of running away. For instance, one place is in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and in verse 18, if you remember, Paul says there to flee from sexual immorality. And really, with any of these, we could fill in the blank with any sin, right? Which, is Paul's point, really. But in 1 Corinthians 6:18, Paul says to flee from sexual immorality. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 14, he says to flee, to run away from idolatry. To have nothing to do with sexual morality, have nothing to do with idolatry. When you see those things coming, and when those temptations are coming that want you to be involved in these things, he says flee. Fleeing is to run away, to run, get out of there as fast as you can. In a couple other passages where Paul says to flee and to run away, he also adds what we should be running towards. So whenever we are feeling in danger, whenever there is something threatening us, we run away from the danger, but we also run to some protection. We run to a good place, to a place of safety. And in 1 Timothy, I want to look at a couple more here. In 1 Timothy chapter 6. In 1 Timothy chapter 6 and in verse 11. Now, the context of this chapter, Paul, he's talking about those who are, saying and doing things, teaching things that aren't right, but they're really doing it out of greed and, corruption and all of these things. And Paul talks about their covetousness and all of that. But he ends up saying, and this is right after he talks about the love of money and how it is the root of all kinds of evil. Right after that, he says in verse 11, "But you, O man of God, flee these things, run away from these things, like the love of money and covetousness and greed and corruption." And again, fill in any sin, anything sinful, anything of the world that is against the righteousness of God. Paul says, flee these things. Run away from those things. Have nothing to do with them. And instead, he adds, pursue. So run after, go after righteousness, godliness, faith, love, patience, gentleness. So not only are we told to run away from sin, but we're to run towards God and His righteousness, to faith, to love, to patience, to gentleness. Run towards God and the hope of eternal life through Jesus. He says this again similarly in his second letter to Timothy, in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and in verse 22. He tells Timothy, flee also youthful lusts. Flee from youthful lusts. Run away. Run away from those things. Stay away from those things. Get away from those things. And instead pursue righteousness, faith, love, peace with those who call on the name of the Lord out of a pure heart. And avoid foolish and ignorant disputes, knowing that they generate strife. And he goes on to talk about how the servant of the Lord must be humble and gentle and patient. Again, the idea is Paul was often telling the Christians, sometimes in the specific kind of illustration of running away, but really in the other times he says to not sin. But here in these several passages, he's saying, folks, we need to run away. We need to realize the consequence and the danger of temptation and sin. And if we truly know the consequences, the danger of temptation and sin, we will run away. It will scare us to death, and we will, when we see it coming, we want to have nothing to do with it, and so we just take off running. And instead, we are going to pursue, we are going to go after, we're going to run after the things of God, righteousness, faith, love, peace, gentleness, all of those things of God. So the question is, though, to all of us, to myself, we got to examine ourselves. Are we running away, though? Are we fleeing temptations? When we see temptation coming, when we find ourselves in a situation where we know we're going to be tempted, or we begin to be tempted, do we tend to linger? Instead of running away, we just kind of stick around to see what happens? Or do we, if you will, do we just kind of slowly, we start to slowly kind of maybe walk away from temptation, but we're going to kind of take our time in case we change our mind, or we're going to kind of start walking the other way from temptation, but really we're kind of looking back over our shoulder, kind of playing on this imagery a little bit. The longer we stick around, the more we linger and play around with temptation and sin, the more susceptible we're going to be, the more likely we're going to give in to temptation and we're going to sin. Which is why Paul says, run. Run away. Get out of there. Don't linger. Don't hesitate. Don't look back. Go. We've got to run away. And finally, I'm reminded to kind of throw this verse in there, that James says in James 4 in verse 7 that we need to submit to God. I'm going to, let me, if I'm allowed, let me play a little bit with the wordage in James 4:7. James says we need to submit to God. Let's say we need to run towards God. We need to, then he says, we need to resist the devil. And you know how we resist the devil? Well, one way, Paul says, is by running away from him. Resisting the urges of temptation, resisting the desire to stick around and find out. No, submit to God, run towards God, resist the devil, run away from the devil. And then, James says, if we do that, then the devil will run away from us. The devil will flee from you, he says. Satan is looking for anybody and everybody, all of us, who he can get to give in to temptation and sin. But if we will listen to God, if we will listen to the Apostle Paul, if we will reject and resist and say no to Satan, and if we will just run away from Satan, then Satan will run away from us. Thanks be to God for that. But we got to do our part. When we see sin, when we see temptation coming, run away. Run away from sin and run towards God. I hope this is a helpful reminder for all of us. God bless.